Okay, hello, welcome to the Essay Skills class. I'm recording this for the second year undergraduate Information Age course. My name is James Sumner, but we're going to talk through at quite a general level this business of writing an essay. This recording is really aimed at people who don't usually write essays in the normal course of business. Can I just ask those of you who are here, none of you, I take it I'll be right in thinking, writes essays regularly as part of any kind of student work. Do you write? Do you write things? Yeah. Okay, what kinds of things?
Code.
Code? Yeah. You write code? Got a couple of computer scientists in here?
I write a blog for the school once.
Excellent. Okay. And so you will be used, in fact, if you're used to blogging, you'll be used to part of the important discipline of writing, because presumably you write down to a particular length. Okay. How long are your blog posts?
Not very long, like
Not
500 words.
500 words. Why are they so short?
I don't think people are that interested for me to write like 1,500 words on my life.
It's not that people aren't interested. Okay, you know, some of the most fascinating stuff in the world is written at very constrained word lengths. Okay, but you can't just sit there and splurge out all of the text that you might conceivably generate about a particular topic. Or rather, you can, right, provided you go back and change it. Okay, now, the coders here. When you'll have to help me out on this, because I'm not a properly trained coder myself. I have written code. It's laughable. Don't ever look at any of it. It's horrible, right? Completely unsystematic, completely untrained. When you write some code, does it work properly first time?
No.
Has that ever been your experience?
You write hello world, yeah?
Yeah, the Hello World program, which is sort of 2 lines long, something like that. That might work first time, but a typical real-life piece of code is not going to work. So what do you do with it?
You do a thing called debugging.
Yeah, and you've got all sorts of nice debugging tools, haven't you? Which can partly automate the process, can analyse the code for you, try and work out what might be wrong with it, things that aren't paired, stuff like that. Now, writing an essay, writing text, unfortunately you haven't got those tools to the same extent, but part of the process is the same, which is to say you should always take a first stab at it and then go back to it. Go through it, work out what can be improved, and you may have to do that several times over. Okay? How many times you need to go through it depends on your particular style, and of course you could keep going through it indefinitely, but you know, time commitments, essay deadlines do tend to come up sooner or later. You are officially, right, on this course, doing the 10 credit version of the course, you are supposed to have 100 hours to play with, and that includes all the time you spend going to lectures, all the time you spend doing background reading, and all the time you spend doing anything connected with the exam. Okay, so we don't expect people to go through and edit and revise indefinitely. We do, I think, probably at this level, and for a 1,500 word essay, we do expect people to go through it several times, I would say. So that is my first and most important point. Good pen, this. Thank you. All writing is rewriting. Okay? That's not literally true, nearly. All writing is rewriting because you will have first drafts. Okay? But aside from that process where you sit down and think roughly through what it is that you want to say and splurge it out, and you might be able to get all of what you want to say out in one go. Probably some people can do that for 1,500 words. Certainly not everybody can. it might take you a few attempts. After that first process, where you get down everything that you want to say, right? You can always tell a lot of the weaker essay submissions that we get, those are the ones that have just left it at that. Okay? It's people who, it's a reasonable assumption to make. You write an essay, you write an essay. Sit there, produce the essay, get to the word length, stop. Okay? Those tend to be really not very good essays. What do you think might be wrong with them?
You might not focus on the point properly.
Focus is the biggest problem. And focusing on the point you mentioned, okay? Relevance, that is something that I'm going to come back to because that is very important. Yeah?
You might forget things or repeat themselves.
Okay, yeah, repetition comes up. And similar point, but if anything more common, you get errors in what we sometimes call choreography. Okay, choreography, the process of when you've got a bunch of dancers dancing about on a stage, in an arena, whatever, working out where everybody's got to go, who's got to stand in front of whom, who has got to move to one side, who's got to go to the other, who's sashaying around whom, who's got to catch whom if they're flying about in the air, anything like that. Okay, that's a dance, obviously. Telling a story in text is a dance. Okay, you've got to look at it in that light, because if you're saying anything that's worth saying, you're saying something about a process, some interactions. You're probably telling a story of maybe one group of people who wanted something to happen and a bunch of other people who desperately wanted to stop it. Or the story of how 3 different ideas came together to make one big idea that changed the world, something like that. So you've got multiple actors, we call them, multiple things that do stuff in play, right? And they're all affecting each other at the same time. And the effects they have on each other are interdependent. But when you've got a text is completely linear. You can only go in 2 directions through a text, forwards and back. Now that means that you've got to make a whole lot of decisions about what comes before what. And some of them will have to be completely artificial decisions. Like, for instance, do you go through it in chronological order? Do you describe everything in the order of the time sequence? Or, if you've got a bunch of things happening in Silicon Valley and a bunch of other things happening in, say, London, do you describe 10 years worth of Californian developments and then 10 years worth of British developments, because those things hang together nicely, and that's the neatest way of telling the story? Now, I don't know the answer to that question. There is no scientific answer to that question. What you can do, of course, is try it out. You can draft it very briefly, very loosely, doesn't have to be well developed, doesn't have to be grammatical, but you can plot it out on a piece of paper and see what happens. Okay, so that's the choreographic development. You've got to have some sort of sequence taking the reader through the essay in a particular order so that it makes sense. And you've got to avoid things that obviously look out of order. Okay, so case in point, just the conventional way that we use names in English, I'd say it's true in most languages. We give a full name on first mention and usually a shorter name on subsequent mentions. So supposing you're talking about, I don't know, name somebody from the history of computing. Okay, Babbage, right. On first mention in an essay, you wouldn't just call him Babbage, would you? How would you refer to him? Charles Babbage, okay? But you wouldn't say, Charles Babbage was born in 1790, whatever it was, Charles Babbage was the son of a banker. Charles Babbage was very interested in manufacturing. You'd say Charles Babbage on first mention and Babbage on second and subsequent mentions. If you were writing quite a long text and you didn't mention him for about 10 pages, next time he came in you might say Charles Babbage again. But that doesn't apply here. Right? You can safely go Babbage, Babbage, Babbage all the way through after the first mention. What you've got to avoid is saying blah, 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 Babbage did this, and then have a paragraph that says Charles Babbage was the son of a banker. That's obviously out of sequence to the reader. Now, that might sound completely obvious to you, and it is obvious. It's just that people keep getting it wrong because they write the essay in one pass in a hurry. So the most important piece of advice, basically your chief source of free marks on this course, whatever you do, right, if you write it once, go away from it for a bit. Okay, put it out of your head. Do whatever is necessary to put it out of your head. You can go away from it for an hour, go and have a run if you're that way inclined. If you're not, if you plan sufficiently far ahead, you can write it on one day. You can go out and get absolutely blind drunk, recover from the hangover, and come back to it. The important thing is that you come back to it fresh without recent memory of having written it, because then you will spot a bunch of stuff that you can improve. If you've got any of those problematic little choreographic inversions, if you've got blah, 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 Babbage, followed by Charles Babbage was the son of a banker, you will spot that, and you will be able to move it. Okay? Now, I'm glad that we mentioned code design already, because there's another nice little connection there. Most programming languages, when I was first picking all this stuff up, I know it's all different now, and there's been a lot of object orientation and all manner of other things, but the standard advice that they used to give to people like me was plan everything from the top down. Okay, so if you are writing a program to, I don't know, if you're programming a robot to make you some breakfast cereal, first of all, you conceptualize the task of making breakfast cereal, what's got to be done there. And then you break it down into its constituent operations. So within make me some breakfast cereal, you've got get a bowl out of the cupboard, and get the milk out of the fridge, and get the cereal out of the cupboard, and then put the bowl down, pour the things into the bowl in the right order, all of that. So start at the top of the process and break it down into a series of tasks. Okay? Now, in an ideal world, that is how everybody would write an essay. That is how to make sure that you have an essay that is the right shape. So, can anybody tell me what the standard structure is for essays that is very widely used in a whole bunch of fields? It's a three-part structure.
Like an introduction, then a main body, and a conclusion.
Yeah. And what are they all for?
And what each part is for.
Yes. They do different jobs, like the business with the module that just gets the bowl out or the module that pulls the milk in. What do they do? Anybody know? Beyond the obvious point that the introduction comes at the beginning.
Like briefly summarises what the essay is going to be about in the introduction.
Yes. Okay, so there will be some summary of what the essay is going to be about in the introduction. And the body. Yeah. The body demonstrates all your main points, and the conclusion makes clear to the reader what has been said. Now, if you put it that way, you might be forgiven for thinking, why have I got to do that? Because the body tells the reader everything that the reader needs to know. So why have an introduction, just summarising it in brief detail, and why have a conclusion, saying it all again at the end? Well, let me try to explain it in a way that justifies these three sections a bit more clearly. First of all, what you've got to remember is that essay writing is a practice, in theory, for writing academic research. And the essence of academic research, so if you treat an essay as a little miniature academic paper, the essence of academic research is that it's supposed to be original. So you're telling the reader something that the reader does not already know. It's a bit artificial, of course. You know, we can't practically assess on original writing for sort of every single undergraduate in the university. When you get to graduate level, you will be writing original stuff much of your time. Here it's a bit different. But the idea is you are trying to explain something which the average reader is going to find difficult and will need help on. So these structural devices give the reader clues to make sure that the reader can follow your argument. Now, argument is very important. The essay doesn't literally begin with the intro, it begins with the title. Okay, and the important thing that the introduction does is to serve as a bridge between the title and body. Because the title is usually saying something quite short. Like, for instance, what's the title we've got on sheet A there? Essay.
How did IBM lose its position as the world's dominant computer
How did IBM lose its position as the world's dominant computer
firm?
firm? Now that's a very short question with not many individual concepts in it. A 1,500 word answer to that question is obviously going to mention a whole bunch of things that are not in the title. Now the reader needs to know why. Okay, so you might be about to mention something like the IBM PC of 1981, or the particular role of Thomas J. Watson Jr., or something like that. The reader, you have to assume, does not know who or what those things are. Now, you're going to be discussing them in some detail in the body. So the introduction gives the reader some reason to buy into them, some reason to understand why they are there. Okay, so a good introduction will do two things. First of all, it will say what the answer to the question is going to be. And that might sound a little bit odd. You're giving away the answer at the beginning of the process. And indeed, that would be a bad move if you were Agatha Christie, the popular detective novelist. Okay? She would not have had the career she's had as one of the best-selling writers of all time if her books had been called things like The Murderer is the Man Pretending to be a Policeman. But you are not writing a detective thriller here. You are writing a piece of explanation that people need to be able to follow. And they will follow it a lot more easily if you tell people where we're going with this. Now, there are various different valid answers to that question. One possible valid answer would be IBM lost its role because it was unable to control the microcomputer when microcomputers became popular. If that's your main answer, if that's the thing you want to focus on, if you think that's the most convincing piece of evidence, say that at the beginning of the essay. Okay? I learned this not from a historian but from a philosopher, a man called Peter Lipton, who used to work at Cambridge, and he put it in these terms. If the question is there such a thing as free will, a good answer could start, in this essay I will show that free will is impossible. because that tells the reader where you're going. Do not start by saying something like, throughout endless generations, humans have debated the problem of free will. That's vague and not very helpful. Give the reader a clue as to where to look. And having done that, or possibly at the same time as doing it, there are different ways to organise an introduction, but the other thing you need to do is to give the reader a map of the essay. Now, the body section will be probably at least 1,000 words long, so there will be a bunch of different things going on in it. And the body section will itself be divided up so it deals with different points. A good way to make sure that you've got a clear map in the introduction is to give one short sentence to each point. That way the reader knows where the essay is going to go. So the essay body is not going to have any twists and turns that are going to take the reader by surprise. Again, twists and turns are very handy if you're Agatha Christie or Stephen King or Alistair MacLean or somebody like that. They're not very useful in this situation where you're trying to explain something. So, the intro gets you from having the title to knowing how the title is going to be answered in terms of a body section. Now the body section, as I say, will be much longer than either of the other two. There is no definite rule on how long any of these things should be. You will see longer and shorter introductions, longer and shorter conclusions. As a rule of thumb, most introductions, most conclusions are about 10 or 15% of the whole each. Okay, so the body could be 70 or 80% of the whole thing. And for that reason, as I say, in order to stay coherent, it's got to be broken down into parts. How many parts? Well, again, it varies. 2 is kind of a difficult number because you very often end up with a sort of a disjointed, broken back structure with 2 parts that are talking about different things, and then it's difficult to make connections across two separate bits later on. 3 is a good number. 3, 4, 5, 6 sections, 6 divisions is fairly common and is a good arrangement. At this length, 1,500 words, they should probably not actually be set up as separate sections with subheadings. If you're going a bit longer, even if you're going to 2,000 words, you might want different subheadings in there. Okay? What they do have to be is properly paragraphed. Now, can anybody tell me anything about paragraph design? How long is a paragraph to begin with? It could be. They actually vary quite a lot. 200 words would be perfectly reasonable. What's that in line length? Anybody know? Have a look at the front of essay A there that I've given you. Do those paragraphs look like they're about the right length for readability? Okay. Some of them could safely be a bit longer and still be readable, couldn't they? Right. So just bear that in mind. Look at some writing. Okay, look at stuff that other people have written. Work out how long you can get away with in terms of paragraph length. Just remember, you've got to plan it all from the top down, because you will find when you do your first draft, you will end up writing probably really, really long paragraphs about things because you're putting down all the evidence that you've got. What you must do when you go through a rewrite is cut. Okay? You will find there is stuff that you don't need to make your argument. Take it out. As a rule, if in doubt, take it out. It's good that you've written it, it's good that you've gone through the process. If it doesn't look like it's helping, if it looks like it's throwing the structure off balance, or it looks like it's not entirely relevant to the answer, take it out. So, you should end up with a bunch of different paragraphs. each of which talks about a separate point. Somewhat separate. They won't be completely separate because they're all in the same essay. But every time you've got a transition from one location to another, or one time period to another, or you're going from one argument to a completely different argument made by people who oppose the first argument, that's got to be in a different paragraph. So again, it's like top-down code design. Paragraphs are a bit like subroutines, if I can use that really old expression. Okay? They're like functions. They each have their own job. And within a paragraph, okay, so there might be, say, 5 paragraphs here. Here's one of them. A paragraph is broken down into sentences, and the same principle applies. Each sentence has got its particular job to do, and a good paragraph has what is called a topic sentence. It's usually a sentence at the beginning of the paragraph, and its job is to explain to the reader what the paragraph is going to be about. Is anybody used to skimming texts to just kind of sort of quickly get the gist of what they're on about? This is something that, again, if you write a lot, one of the most important things to do to learn how to write is to read a lot. You don't have to read everything in detail. Some things you do, things that seem particularly important, but it's a standard task for me as a historian to sit down usually in the library with a bunch of paper publications, not electronic, because this is usually stuff that you can't get hold of electronically, even now. I'll sit down with literally 10 or 15 books, and I will go through them in an hour. I won't read them, obviously, that would be impossible. What I will do is flick through them, and sometimes, for the most relevant stuff, skim them in more detail to establish what needs to be looked at closely later on. And a good skimming technique for well-written text is just to look at the first sentence of each paragraph. You'll try this, look at some published texts with sort of medium-length paragraphs. If you just look at the first sentences, you will be able to pick up the sense of where the argument is going, what the writer's on about. That's because those topic sentences clearly introduce the paragraphs they refer to. It's a good way of guiding the reader through the text, sometimes called signposting. Okay? Again, you're not Agatha Christie. Don't be afraid to give the reader clues as to where you're going next. So, the body section should walk the reader through the steps of your argument. So, if you were writing that essay about IBM, you might have a paragraph setting it up, saying where IBM had come from to be in this position that it was going to lose, and then you might say something about the argument that IBM was an inflexible corporate monolith, which some authors have argued, and then you might say something in another paragraph about the rise of the microcomputer and so on. In the end, you should have provided, by the end of the body section, all the clues the reader would need to be able to understand what the answer is. But, as long as you're in the body section, you're looking at everything in detail. You are very close to the source material. And the old expression is, you might have difficulty seeing the wood for the trees. You can see the individual things, but you can't see the pattern so easily close up. So the conclusion is where you take a step back. The conclusion is where you say anything that needs to be said that is too broad, too overspanning to be said within one individual body paragraph. Okay? So, case in point, why did London come to dominate British national identity when, in the 19th century, civic towns were very powerful? You could have a chapter about Manchester, you could have a chapter about Belfast, you could have a chapter about Leeds. If it was a book, if it was an essay, you could have a paragraph about Manchester, a paragraph about Belfast, and so forth. Right? They're all different. In the conclusion, you could say, across the differences, what they all have in common is this. These are the factors that led to their relative decline in terms of national status. And here is why London was different. You get that? Okay, so by the end of the conclusion, what has to have happened is that the reader knows what the answer to the question is and why. And it's very important. This is your. There are two major sources of free marks on offer. One of them I've already explained, which is draft and rewrite. The other one is answer the question. Don't do what, again, a lot of people do, which is to write some stuff that is relevant to the question. It's easy to spend quite a lot of time doing quite hard work and still only manage that, because you're doing the research process right. You look at the question, you find some sources, books or articles, that are relevant to the question, you make notes on those sources, you summarise the sources in an essay. And that is quite skilled work, and you can spend a long time on it. But it won't get you as much credit as taking those sources and understanding them and using them to answer the question. So when you're writing, when you're working out what to make the focus of a paragraph or how to build a particular sentence, design it top down from the question, not bottom up from the sources. The sources are not trying to do what you're trying to do. Any questions on that? Now, this is of course very easy to say in theory. It's hard to do in practice, and the only way to do it well is to practice doing it. Okay? But it is a useful skill to have, or come in useful in all kinds of walks of life. Okay? Everybody writes things sooner or later, even if you end up in a straightforward heads down computer sciencey type job, or a mathsy type of job, you will be writing reports. You will be writing things, even if it's just emails, which need to convince other people. Okay, and it's the same deal with the blog post. You can learn a lot from knowing the difference between a good blog post and a good essay. Right? They're both skilled jobs, but a good blog post is a bad essay, and a good essay is a bloody awful blog post. Partly because it's 3 times as long as it should be. Now, mention of building the text up from the sources and why it's a bad idea takes me to the question of quoting and referencing things. Okay? And we had a question earlier, which is when do you put a reference? And I'd like to ask another question first, which is when do you quote things directly? When is that a good idea? Never. That's not the worst answer that you could have given, actually. If you simply never quote anything directly, then you will avoid some of the chief sources of badness that I see in essays. There are situations when it is a good idea to quote things directly. For instance, when the particular wording of something that was established in the history of the case is relevant. So if it's something like a patent specification, there is one particular patent which there was a big legal controversy about this in the United States. There is a patent which is held to be the patent for the principle of the computer, generally. Now, if you can collect the royalties on that patent, then you're collecting the royalties from anybody who can make a computer, which will make you very, very wealthy. Okay? But does that patent accurately describe what all computers are? In that situation, you've got to give the reader the exact wording in the patent, otherwise the reader's not going to quite understand the argument. So that's a good situation where you could use a quotation. There are a couple of others, actually, and they are listed in the essay guidelines. Has everybody seen the essay guidelines? In order to make it difficult to miss the essay guidelines, I've put them in the same document, in the same PDF as the essay titles. So if you've seen the titles, if you scroll forward past page 1, you will find all of that advice. Okay? Now, people often quote a lot of material because they start off collecting it from the sources, and they carefully put it into quotation marks. For what reason?
So that they understand when they go back to.
Actually, the reason why people are careful about putting things into quotation marks is that they are, well, they're doing a sensible thing. They are avoiding the risk of plagiarism. Okay, what is plagiarism? Taking something that's not yours and claiming credit for it. And why is plagiarism, well, the reason it's bad is that it's intellectually dishonest, okay? You're passing off somebody else's work as your own. The reason why it's dangerous in a university context is that most problematic things you can do are merely counted as being, you know, not very skilled, okay? And so you lose marks for them. Plagiarism is counted as being academic malpractice, and it can only be subject to disciplinary action. So in formal terms, it's the difference between bad in the sense of crap and bad in the sense of evil. So people are rightly very, very careful about whenever they use somebody else's words, putting quotation marks around them. The problem is they then take text that is in quotation marks and properly attribute it, and then they leave it in the essay when it's not very useful to the essay. Because if you're using somebody else's text, they wrote it to make their argument, which is not the same as your argument. You might support them, but you've probably got a different emphasis. You can make your point more quickly and easily using your own words. A lot of people don't like using their own words because they're not as skilled prose stylists as the authors that they're making use of. Don't worry about that. You will get marks for the quality of your arguments, for your ability to put things together. If you can write nice, readable prose, that is the icing on the cake, but it's not the essential thing. So you're better off writing it in your own words. But if it's somebody else's idea, whether you're using their words or not, you should always put a reference. If you don't put a reference, and it's somebody else's particular idea, then you've stolen their idea. And that's plagiarism. So plagiarism is absolutely nothing to do with whether you use the exact words or not. If you take somebody else's text and change the words a bit, if you don't attribute it, it's still plagiarism. If you do attribute it, if you put a note saying what the source is, then it can't be plagiarism. Now the question that came up was, when should I put a note to something? And if you put a note on everything, then you certainly won't commit any academic malpractice. But sometimes it's not necessary. It's not necessary for anything that is common knowledge. And this is a difficult thing to define. Does anybody know what common knowledge means for our purposes? Right, it's not stuff that everybody knows. Common knowledge is something that anybody could reasonably find out, and it doesn't belong to one particular source. So, if I said that Spencer Perceval was the only British Prime Minister who was ever assassinated in office, did you know that? No? Nobody here knew that. But it is common knowledge because you can look it up in all manner of different sources, right? There's not one guy who found out that Spencer Perceval was assassinated in office, right? It's a well-known fact. Nobody will get any particular credit for claiming it. It's in all sorts of reference texts. Wherever you go to look it up, you will find the same. There is no serious disagreement with that point. So can anybody think of a similar piece of information that would be common knowledge, maybe from your own field, maybe something that I wouldn't know but you would? Give me something from maths. You must know some maths. Suppose, I don't know, the 17th digit in the value of pi as a decimal. Okay? I don't know what that is, right? But if you quoted it, you would not need to put a reference. You don't need a source for values of pi. If you need values of pi, you can get them easily enough, couldn't you? Right, so there's no particular need there. Okay. If it's something that is an opinion, right, like Bletchley Park, the code-breaking operation shortened the course of the Second World War by 18 months, right, that is not common knowledge. A lot of people have heard that claim, but it is a matter of opinion. It rests on the views of particular people. You have to say where you found that. You've got to give an indication of why the reader should be convinced by it. You need some sort of authority who knows about it. And similarly, even if it's something that's factually true, but it only appears in one particular place, so there's one person who's done a bit of research and found out about, I don't know, the origins of some particular idea, right? And they published it in one place. It was published last year, maybe. Nobody else has worked on it, right? You should then definitely give a reference. Not because it's in any way unlikely, but because you've got to give the reader a clue as to where to find this information. The information will be difficult to find. You've got to help the reader. In fact, I could more or less get rid of everything that I say and replace it with the injunction, help the reader, in letters of fire. Okay, we have had nearly an hour. Do you want to go on for a bit? Or have you got other things to get to?
Yeah, I've got a lecture to go through.
Okay.
Can you answer the question about the coursework and the exam for that?
Yes, yes I can. Okay. Right, so we try to make sure that nobody gets any unfair advantages in this course as far as possible. So, therefore, ideally, there should not be an opportunity for anyone to answer questions on the exam where they've already got a lot of prior knowledge based on the essay. The way we try to deal with this is by making sure that there isn't any overlap between the subject areas of the exams and the essays. We could have a rule that said, okay, well, if you wrote an essay on this, then you can't do the exam question, but that wouldn't be fair to you, would it? Because you'd only get a choice of 5 questions, and everybody else would have a choice of 6. So, as far as possible, we manage it by making sure there isn't overlap. Of course, there will always be a little bit of overlap, because themes are quite wide-ranging, particularly on this course, and there will always be similarities between the material. We hope that that will not be significant enough to affect anybody's chances. Of course, we do have the options of people setting free questions that aren't listed on the sheets, and sometimes somebody will be in danger of steering into the territory of an existing exam question, and in that situation I will advise them to think again. So if I'm doing my job properly, it will not come up as a problem. Is that all right? Okay, I'm going to turn the recording off now.